They fined me, stalked me, tried to break me over a fence, a greenhouse, and a house I owned fair and square. What they didn't know? I don't back down. By the time I was done, their precious lakefront kingdom was mine, and their empire was ash in the wind. Let me tell you how it happened. It was supposed to be a quiet life. That's what I told myself the day I signed the deed for the lakefront property. A sprawling 2-acre slice of peace at the edge of Pine Hollow, Oregon. After 16 years working 80-hour weeks as an architect in Seattle, I'd finally cashed out of the rat race. My plan was simple: renovate the aging 2-story home overlooking the water, build a small dock for my kayak, and grow old in blessed obscurity. No city noise, no rush hour, no forced small talk. Just me, my tools, and the loons on the lake. I moved in late spring. The air still held a bite, but the lake shimmered like glass in the morning sun. I remember standing on my back porch with a cup of burnt diner coffee, watching mist curl off the water, thinking, "You finally did it, Evan. You made it." The first few weeks were perfect. I tore down the old deck, hauled in new cedar boards, and started on a greenhouse in the back corner. Solitude suited me. No one bothered me, and I didn't bother them. Then came the envelope, thin, official-looking, with an HOA logo I didn't recognize. I remember chuckling at it, assuming it was junk mail. I was wrong. Inside was a letter from the Pine Hollow Lakeside Community Association. A warm welcome, it said, followed by a list of mandatory compliance notices. I was allegedly in violation of 7 architectural guidelines, including the unauthorized color of exterior siding, natural wood, apparently a crime, and a fine of $600 for failure to register with the HOA. It also mentioned my non-compliant firewood storage and disruptive exterior lighting. Solar path lights from Home Depot, if you're wondering. There was one problem. I had reviewed the property boundaries before buying. I was not within HOA jurisdiction. I triple-checked. My land was part of an older plat grandfathered in before the HOA was formed. I sent them a polite letter with copies of the survey and my deed. I assumed that would be the end of it. 3 days later, a woman showed up at my gate, blonde bob, clipboard in hand, white SUV idling behind her like a government threat. She didn't introduce herself, just launched into a speech about community expectations and how even independent parcels are encouraged to voluntarily align with standards. When I asked her name, she sniffed and said, "Karen. I'm the president of the board." I told her as calmly as possible that I appreciated the concern but had no intention of repainting my house or paying for the privilege of being told to cut my grass to exactly 3 inches. I didn't say, "Get off my land," but I probably thought it loudly enough. That's when she smiled, a slow, condescending smile like a teacher indulging a very dumb child. "You'll come around," she said before turning on her heels and walking back to her SUV. A week later, someone jammed expanding foam into the lock on my front gate. Coincidence? Maybe. But I started seeing more of those white SUVs cruising by. A security vehicle, clearly contracted by the HOA, began slow-rolling past my property at dusk, headlights scanning my driveway like I was running a meth lab out of my tool shed. I caught a man taking photos from across the street. When I walked toward him, he got in his car and drove off. Later that night, my mailbox was filled with printed notices, all unsigned, reminding me of civic responsibility and the importance of conformity in shared environments. Still, I refused to play along. I had all the legal backing I needed. I was on solid ground, literally and figuratively, but that didn't stop them. The HOA began acting like a private militia, escalating from fines to threats of forced compliance. They sent me another letter, this time with a bolded demand to cease construction on my greenhouse. A red tag notice appeared stapled to one of the corner beams, again unsigned. It was surreal. I wasn't in their jurisdiction, but they acted like the lake gave them moral dominion over everything it touched. The kicker came when I got invited to a mandatory neighborhood meeting at the Community Resource Center, which turned out to be a quaint little cabin near the public boat ramp. Locals called it the Lakehouse. I'd seen it before, adorable white-painted trim stone patio bunting in summer. Apparently it was HOA HQ, the sacred temple where all things suburban were discussed, judged, and decreed. The invitation came with a warning. Failure to attend would be viewed as non-cooperation. So I went. I sat through an hour of passive-aggressive PowerPoints about property values, visual harmony, and shared aesthetic duties. Karen stood at the podium like she was hosting the goddamn G7 summit. When I finally spoke up, explaining that I wasn't part of the HOA and didn't plan to be, I was met with stunned silence. Then came the nods. Slow, solemn nods like I'd admitted to sacrificing goats in the basement. "You're making things harder than they need to be," one man whispered as I passed him on the way out. I didn't respond. I just walked back to my truck, watching the reflection of the Lakehouse in the windshield. Clean, uniform, polished to a shine. A fake little kingdom. And I knew right then that they weren't going to stop. But neither was I. It didn't take long for them to escalate. Less than a week after that circus of a meeting at the Lakehouse, a formal violation packet arrived by courier. It was a thick manila envelope, the kind usually reserved for subpoenas or government threats. Inside was a printout of 13 separate violations. 13. They had itemized my life. Among the crimes against community peace, improper lawn edging, visible firewood stack, unapproved mailbox shape, and, my personal favorite, a structure inconsistent with neighborhood character. That last one, they clarified, referred to my greenhouse, a structure made of reclaimed timber and recycled glass that apparently offended someone's sense of symmetry. They attached photos as evidence. Someone had walked onto my property to take them. No name, no signature. Just the seal of the HOA at the top of every page, as if that made the trespass legal. I shredded the packet and dropped the remains into a burn barrel out back. That night, my security light flickered. It hadn't done that before. I checked the wiring in the morning. Someone had tampered with it. A small cut along the cable near the base, clean and deliberate. I installed a new camera system the same day. That was the first time I caught them on video. 2 men around midnight wearing casual hoodies and gloves walking along the edge of my property like they were checking blueprints. One of them paused by the greenhouse, shone a flashlight into it, then scribbled something onto a clipboard. I watched the footage 3 times, my pulse steady but rising. That wasn't enforcement. That was surveillance. I called the sheriff's department, gave them the footage, and was met with the usual shrug. "They're probably just security contractors," the deputy said, sipping from a thermos. "HOAs around here hire them. Technically, if they didn't come more than a few feet into your land, it's not trespassing. Barely." He said it with the same tone you'd use to talk about raccoons. I asked him if barely was grounds for an arrest when someone broke into his backyard at midnight. He didn't answer, just gave me a printed form to file a complaint and said I should keep documenting everything. I left with a folder and a growing sense that this wasn't a game of property lines anymore. It was psychological warfare. 2 days later, flyers showed up in neighbor mailboxes. I got a copy from the guy who lived 2 doors down, Chuck, ex-military, kept to himself. He handed it to me without a word, and I could see he was uncomfortable. The flyer had my name in bold. Under it, "Does this man represent our values?" It listed false accusations, Loud music, improper waste disposal, aggressive behavior toward HOA staff. I read the whole thing twice. They were trying to poison the well. I'd lived here less than 3 months and was already the villain in someone's morality play. They started weaponizing the community. Karen stopped pretending to be civil. She sent me an invoice for accrued compliance penalties. $2,400. She stapled it to my front gate. No envelope. Just wind-flapping paper like an execution notice in a spaghetti western. Then came the camera. One morning I walked outside and spotted it. A small white dome mounted to the top of a utility pole directly across from my gate. It wasn't a traffic cam. I checked with the county. It was privately installed. HOA property. Facing only my driveway. I called them, asked them politely if they planned to take it down. The man on the other end, someone named Reggie, who sounded like he couldn't spell jurisdiction, told me it was for community safety. I asked who the hell they were keeping safe from a guy renovating his deck. He said, "You've created a hostile environment. We're allowed to protect ourselves." That same afternoon, I noticed a familiar truck parked near the tree line. Same guy I'd seen snapping photos a week ago. I didn't approach him this time. I just walked back inside, opened my laptop, and started pulling title records. It took some digging. County archives weren't exactly user-friendly. But after a few hours and a very helpful old clerk named Diane, I found something odd. The official HOA map, the one they kept waving in my face, showed their jurisdiction ending well before the start of my property. But when I overlaid it with the satellite image and the most recent plat, the lines didn't match. Not by a lot, but enough to matter. And the kicker? The quaint little lake house they loved so much, where they hosted meetings, brunches, HOA happy hours. That building sat partially on my land. Not a foot, not a corner, a full 15% of the lot. I stared at that screen for a long time, heart thumping not from rage but from something colder, calculated. If this was what I thought it was, that Lakehouse wasn't just their pride and joy, it was their vulnerability. Their sacred cow was standing on stolen pasture. I printed everything, marked the boundaries in red ink, filed it in a folder marked for war. By the end of that week, Karen showed up at my property line again, arms crossed, smug look, locked and loaded. "We'll fine you daily if you keep the greenhouse," she said. "Go ahead," I told her. "Just make sure the lake house is still standing by the time you do." For the first time, I saw the smile falter. Just a flicker. But it was enough. It started with a knock that didn't sound like a neighbor. You know the kind, sharp, practiced, not waiting for permission. I was in the garage working on a new cedar frame for the side fence when I heard it. 3 knocks, pause, 2 more, authority rhythm. I wiped my hands, walked to the front door, and opened it to find 2 uniformed officers standing on my porch like they'd rehearsed the pose. One held a clipboard. The other rested a hand casually near his belt. "Mr. Evan Rivers?" "Yup." "We've received a report of a physical altercation involving you and a contracted safety officer from the Pine Hollow Lakeside Association. Do you mind stepping outside to talk?" I raised an eyebrow. "A physical what?" The one with the clipboard didn't blink. "The complainant alleges you shoved their employee during an enforcement visit yesterday." That was bold, flat-out fiction. I hadn't even seen anyone near my property the day before. I asked for a badge number, got 2. Told them I had security footage of every square inch of my fence line. They said I could provide it later. For now, they were placing me under Tare temporary detention. Pending review of the complaint. I laughed, out loud. "You're cuffing me based on an HOA rumor?" They didn't laugh back. My wrists were locked behind me before I could get my phone out. I wasn't technically arrested, just detained for questioning. But that didn't stop them from taking me downtown like I'd shoplifted a chainsaw. They held me for 12 hours. No formal charges, no explanation beyond, "We're waiting for the community board to send over documentation." They never did. I sat in a holding cell next to a guy who smelled like regret and cheap malt liquor, wondering how the hell I'd become the antagonist in a Kafka novel. When they finally released me without apology, I stepped outside into the fluorescent gray of a strip-lit lobby, and there she was. Karen, sitting on a bench like she was waiting for a manicure. She stood as I exited, smiled, and said, "We all have to follow the rules, Mr. Rivers. I hope this was educational." I didn't say a word, just walked past her, called my lawyer, and didn't stop walking until I reached my truck. Said lawyer, Alan Gilroy, property rights specialist with the temperament of a rabid badger, was apoplectic when he saw the footage. I showed him the time-stamped security video. No one on my land that day. No interaction, no shoving, not even a squirrel with attitude. "Jesus Christ," Alan muttered. "They're not just overreaching, they're orchestrating." By the end of the week, we had a strategy. He filed an official civil harassment complaint against the HOA, citing false allegations, attempted fraud, and abuse of process. We attached the footage, the GPS-tagged timestamps, and the exact clause in the county code proving I was outside their jurisdiction. Then we got to the good part. While Alan handled the legal side, I kept digging into the land use records. I'd started assembling in my war folder. Something wasn't adding up. The Lakehouse, their Lakehouse, sat on a sliver of land that had never fully transferred ownership. I found it in a plat record from more 18 years ago, right after the HOA formed. There had been an intended easement to incorporate part of a lakeside strip into community use, but it had never been formalized when in the registry. Even better, the previous owner of that land, some guy named Harlan Deeks, had filed a quitclaim deed that was never notarized, never recorded, and never taxed. That meant one thing: the transaction was never legal. HOA had essentially built their headquarters on land they assumed they owned. Problem was, I owned the other side of that sliver. And when I overlaid the original land survey with my deed, it became painfully clear. The Lakehouse sat on a full 12 feet into my property. The real gold mine came from an old county permit application I found buried in the digital archive, tied to an email address no longer active. It referenced temporary usage of adjacent lot for civic gathering space, with Harlan Deeks as the applicant. Except I found another form signed 6 months later where Harlan refused to sell. Somewhere between those two forms, a deal had been made, a deal that was never properly recorded. A dirty deal by the look of it. Alan called in a contact from the assessor's office. After reviewing the documents, he whistled and said, "This is bad for them. If this goes public, you're not just looking at a boundary dispute. You're looking at fraudulent land use, possibly wire fraud and civil conspiracy." We sat in silence for a long moment before Alan leaned forward and said, "We don't just have a case now. We have a bomb." I asked what he needed from me. He said, "Photos, documentation, affidavits. We build a case for no civil damages and land reclamation. And then we aim straight for their sacred cow." It felt strange, this shift from hunted to hunter. But I didn't mind. The next morning, I installed a new sign at the edge of my property, a clean white board mounted on reclaimed pine. It read, "Notice, private property, unauthorized entry prohibited, Lakehouse structure subject to pending legal action." The next evening, a notice appeared in my mailbox. Another fine, this time for intimidation of community structures. I laughed so hard I nearly fell off the porch. The morning we filed the lawsuit, Alan brought me coffee and a copy of the complaint with a grin so smug you'd think he'd just won a Pulitzer. "They'll crap bricks," he said, sliding the packet across my kitchen table. Big HOA-shaped bricks. The complaint was 64 pages. It detailed harassment, trespassing, false fines, and a claim of unlawful occupation of private land. But the core of it was beautiful in its simplicity. The Pine Hollow Lakeside HOA had built and operated a community facility on land they didn't own, had no claim to, and attempted to cover it up with phony documentation. We sent copies to the county clerk, the district court, and because why not, forwarded a version to every HOA board member by certified mail. The next day I heard Karen's voice echo down my driveway before I saw her. She was in full regalia, cardigan over white blouse, oversized sunglasses, heels that did not belong on gravel. She didn't make it to my porch. I met her halfway. "You've made a serious mistake," she said, holding up the complaint like it was radioactive. "No," I replied. "You made a serious assumption. I'm just giving it a proper burial." She launched into a familiar monologue about community values and harmony. I didn't listen. I was focused on the way her jaw twitched when she glanced at the Lakehouse, still visible between the trees. I gave her a choice: remove the Lakehouse voluntarily and vacate my land within 30 days, or we continue in court. Her silence was my answer. That week, the HOA circled its wagons. Suddenly, I was bombarded with legal counter-notices. They claimed I was trying to destabilize community governance, that I'd fabricated boundaries, and my personal favorite, that I posed a physical threat to shared property. They sent a letter to every resident in the neighborhood. I saw a copy pinned to the bulletin board at the general store. It had my name in bold, along with phrases like hostile actor and rogue litigant. It was equal parts defamatory and desperate. But then came the cracks. Chuck, the ex-military guy who'd handed me the flyer a few weeks back, showed up at my door one evening with a Tupperware of banana bread and a folder. "I kept some stuff," he said, eyes flicking toward the woods behind us. "Didn't sit right with me." Inside the folder were minutes from HOA meetings. Unofficial ones, held outside the mandated record-keeping process. Chuck had been on the board briefly before resigning. He'd held on to the records out of suspicion, and they were gold. There were handwritten notes referencing a gentleman's agreement with the previous owner of the Lakehouse lot. Code phrases like "no formal filings unless oversight" and "Deke's not interested in paperwork." That aligned perfectly with the fraudulent deed Alan had flagged. Even better, there was a scribbled budget entry. Donation to HD, $45,000, Lakehouse access. It was a bribe. No paper trail, no taxes, no record, and it was criminal. Alan nearly choked on his scone when he read it. This isn't just HOA arrogance. This is real estate fraud. And if that donation came from HOA dues, they embezzled it, I finished. He nodded. We need to loop in the DA. While Alan began the process of notifying the district attorney's office, I took a little drive down to the county zoning department. I requested inspection reports for the Lakehouse. There were 2. The first was filed 7 years ago and signed off by a man named Dennis Flack, a zoning inspector. The second, more recent, was also signed by Flack. One problem: Flack had died 4 years ago. I asked the clerk if it was a clerical error. She went pale. We had a forged signature on a government document approving the existence of a building that never legally existed on land. It didn't legally occupy. By the time Alan heard about that, he was already halfway through a deposition request for Karen and 3 board members. We amended the lawsuit with new charges: fraudulent use of public documents, unauthorized use of member dues, and a willful trespass. Meanwhile, the community started to splinter. One of the board members, Tracy Geller, VP of Aesthetic Oversight, resigned suddenly. Her husband was seen packing up their Range Rover late one night. Another member filed a restraining order against Karen. Rumors flew that Karen had forced through the Lakehouse deal by threatening board members with fines, that she'd held secret votes, even that she had rewritten parts of the HOA charter without quorum. Someone, no one claimed responsibility, emailed a copy of the lawsuit to the Pine Hollow Chronicle. Within 48 hours, the story was on the front page. Lakehouse lies, HOA sued over land grab. Neighbors started whispering. I heard two at the market debating whether they should stop paying dues. Another asked me quietly if I had a good lawyer. I told him, the best, and he drinks scotch before court. By the end of the month, subpoenas had been issued. The DA opened a formal inquiry, and Allen filed a motion for the temporary restraining order to prevent HOA from holding any further meetings at the Lakehouse. We won that motion. The court sealed the property pending litigation. On the day the signs went up, property closed by order of Jackson County Court. Karen stood across the water with binoculars in hand, watching like a widow at sea. Her empire, built on HOA arrogance and not-so-gentlemen's agreements, was beginning to crack. And I hadn't even started the demolition. The courtroom looked like something out of a forgotten civic drama from the 70s. Beige walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and a judge's bench that had seen more bad lies than good law. But to me, it might as well have been an arena, because this wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. This was the showdown. By the time we reached the first hearing, the case had blown up. Local media ran with it like it was Watergate by the lake. A few neighborhood blogs dubbed it Lakehouse Gate, which I hated but Allen loved. Every seat in the courtroom was filled. Neighbors, reporters, off-duty realtors, even one guy who said he just liked watching HOA people get humbled. Fair enough. Judge George McLean presided, a no-nonsense federal magistrate with a reputation for despising two things: grandstanding and misuse of power. The moment he took the bench, the entire room stiffened. He didn't even look at Karen when he told both parties to check their egos at the door and their nonsense at the curb. Allen opened with fire. He laid out our evidence like a surgeon exposing rot, minute by minute, document by document. Photos of the Lakehouse encroaching on my land, survey maps, GPS-tagged footage of HOA contractors trespassing, copies of the fake fines, a notarized letter from Chuck. Then came the bomb. The fraudulent quitclaim deed and the $45,000 bribe. When Allen presented the records of the transaction, highlighted, annotated, and stacked like a paper guillotine, the room went quiet. We followed it with the inspection permit bearing the signature of Dennis Flack, issued 2 years after his death. The courtroom murmured. The judge leaned forward. "Are you telling me," he said slowly, "that a homeowners association constructed a building on land it did not own, concealed the boundaries, funneled member dues into an off-book payment, and filed a permit under a forged signature?" "Yes, Your Honor," Allen replied. "And they fined my client over $10,000 homeowners in illegal citations while doing it." Karen's attorney, a nervous, neck-sweating man named Rick, fumbled with a folder and tried to shift blame onto clerical misunderstandings, unverified records, and community oversight inconsistencies. It didn't work. Karen was called to testify. She took the stand in pearls and defiance. Allen dismantled her one sentence at a time. "You were president when the Lakehouse was constructed." "Yes." "And you authorized the payment to Mr. Deeks?" "There was no payment. It was a donation." "To a man who never filed a legal deed?" "It was understood." Was it understood that he died 3 months after the agreement? That silenced the room. She tried to pivot, accusing me of harassment, of being combative, of destabilizing the community. Alan let her ramble, then calmly submitted our 26 pieces of video evidence showing the HOA's surveillance, fence tampering, even a clip of Karen herself standing in my driveway with a measuring tape. Rick looked like he wanted to crawl into his briefcase and zip it shut. Then came the DA's office. They filed a criminal investigation memorandum during the proceedings. The court was formally notified that the HOA board was under review for vicidom, fraudulent use of public records, unauthorized use of funds, and on misappropriation of assets. Karen's face turned a new shade of pale. After 2 days of hearings, testimonies, and the slow public unraveling of a power cult in cardigans, Judge McLean delivered his verdict. The gavel fell hard. The HOA was found liable on all civil counts. Here's what the judgment ordered. The HOA was to pay me $360,000 on in total compensation, $75,000 on for emotional distress and harassment, $45,000 on in legal expenses, $180,000 on in damages tied to unlawful fines, use of land, and disruption of property use. $60,000 on for commercial losses related to my postponed guest house project. Ownership of the Lakehouse was transferred to me, in full and uncontested, effective immediately. The HOA was ordered to disband its existing board and operate under court-appointed audit supervision for 2 years. Karen Blake, some former president, was fined $50,000, barred from holding any official position in a non-profit for 5 years, sentenced to 18 months of probation, pending outcome of the DA's ongoing criminal case. As the judge read the final orders, the courtroom felt less like a civic institution and more like a church after a fire, stunned, silent, smoky with shame. Karen stood and walked out without a word. Rick packed up in silence. Alan looked at me, grinned, and muttered, "Well, I suppose we own a lake house now." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. I said nothing. Just walked to my truck, loosened my tie, and looked out at the gray Oregon sky. For the first time in months, it didn't feel heavy. It felt wide open. 2 days after the verdict, I unlocked the front door of the Lakehouse for the first time as its legal owner. The key was still warm from the county clerk's hand when I turned it. Inside, the air was stale with neglect and something sharper, maybe desperation. Framed photos of past HOA events lined the walls. Smiling people in beige polos and matching visors, potluck picnics, community yoga, election day ceremonies. Every image was like a shrine to the illusion they'd built. The floorboards creaked under my boots. The place was empty, silent, except for the light buzz of the fridge still running, probably full of expired hummus and power fantasies. I stood in the center of the main room, the same room where they'd tried to discipline me months ago, and laughed. Not a bitter laugh. Something lighter. Like pressure releasing from a valve. I owned this place now. Their sanctuary, their command post, their little white temple by the water. It was mine. Legally, irrevocably, and poetically. I posted a notice on the front door that day. Under new ownership, public events suspended until further notice. The sign stayed up for exactly 48 hours before I replaced it with a new one. You're all welcome, bring beer. Because I threw a party, nothing fancy, just folding chairs, smoked brisket, some good beer, and a Bluetooth speaker blasting Johnny Cash. I invited everyone in the neighborhood, not the board members, obviously. They'd all either skipped town or crawled into whatever hole they were licking their wounds in. But the regular folks, the ones who never spoke up, The ones who dropped me quiet looks of sympathy in the past, but never dared to say more. To my surprise, a lot of them came. Chuck brought ribs and sat in the back like a sentry, sipping bourbon from a travel mug. Maggie, the sweet 70-year-old from down the hill, made cornbread and confessed she'd stopped paying HOA dues 2 months before the trial. A few teenagers showed up and asked if they could fish off the dock. I said, sure, just don't hook my kayak. There was laughter that night, the kind that sounds strange after months of silence and tension. And for once, no one used the word compliance. The fall of the HOA was not quiet. After the court ruling, resignations came fast. Tracy Geller formally stepped down and tried to sell her house before the ink dried. Another board member, Colin Wright, claimed he'd been duped by Karen and fled the state before the DA could serve him with a subpoena. Karen herself, well, she tried to hold on for about a week. Then came the leaks. An anonymous source, probably someone inside the remaining skeleton crew, sent the HOA's internal emails to the press. Full threads showing Karen bullying board members into approving fake policies, suppressing dissent, and spending nearly $70,000 in HOA funds on beautification projects that had all gone to her cousin's landscaping company. Her reputation cratered overnight. She resigned in disgrace. Word got around that she'd listed her house at a loss and moved in with her sister in Bend. No one cried. The new interim board, led by a guy named Trevor who worked in IT and actually read bylaws, announced a full audit, a freeze on all fees, and an open forum to redesign the HOA charter from scratch. They even asked if I wanted to be part of the new oversight committee. I politely declined. I was done with meetings. Besides, I had renovations to do. I started with the Lakehouse, ripped out the moldy curtains, tore up the carpet, refinished the hardwood, repainted the exterior, same cedar tone as my own home. I turned the main room into a multi-use community space, workshop during the week, movie nights on Fridays. I installed bookshelves, a projector, and a coffee machine that didn't require an engineering degree to operate. People started coming by. Teenagers built birdhouses, retirees held book clubs. Even a few former HOA loyalists returned, quiet, contrite, asking if they could help. I said yes. Grudges rot the soul, and frankly, I had won. What was left to prove? The most unexpected visitor came on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was sweeping the porch when a black SUV pulled up. Out stepped the guy who used to patrol my property with a flashlight and clipboard, Reggie. He looked different in jeans and a flannel. No clipboard, no badge, just hands in pockets and a sheepish expression. I got laid off, he said. Not that I'm complaining. I offered him coffee. We sat in the Lakehouse kitchen, the same place I'd once imagined burning down in frustration. Reggie admitted he didn't know half of what the board was doing. Said Karen paid him cash to monitor problem residents. He paused before continuing. You were the only one I ever felt bad about. I told him if he was looking for work, I could use a hand fixing the old dock. He accepted on the spot. The irony didn't escape either of us. By the end of the month, the Lakehouse was no longer a weapon. It was a refuge. For the first time since I moved to Pine Hollow, the air felt breathable. No cameras watching, no notices stapled to gates, no HOA thugs in ill-fitting polos citing code violations like commandments from a petty god. I didn't just get my land back. I got my peace. And I got to watch their little empire crumble brick by smug brick. Winter hit Pine Hollow early that year. Frost clung to the grass like it was afraid of being forgotten. The lake, usually restless with morning mist and ripples from passing kayaks, turned to glass. Still. Sharp. The kind of quiet that made your ears ring. It was perfect. I woke up one morning to the smell of pine smoke and realized it had been exactly 1 year since I'd moved in. A year ago, I'd been unpacking boxes in the back of my truck, naive enough to think a solar light could start a war. Now I stood on the porch of a building I legally owned, a building that had once been used as a throne by tyrants in golf attire, and sipped coffee brewed in a machine I didn't need to fight to use. The Lakehouse was no longer a lake house. We'd renamed it the Dock. Short, simple, open to everyone. No HOA meetings, no dues, no flyers about fence height or lawn alignment. Just neighbors. Real ones. A woodworking class met there every Thursday. On Fridays, we hosted bad movie night. A group of retired librarians held poetry readings on Sunday mornings, usually followed by gossip disguised as critiques. It was strange, really. Once the HOA dissolved, people didn't devolve into chaos. No lawns caught fire. No one painted their house neon green. The neighborhood didn't collapse into Mad Max-style anarchy like Karen used to threaten. It actually got better. Chuck, the ex-military neighbor, now ran a tool-lending library out of his garage. Maggie organized a weekend cleanup without being asked or fined. Reggie, the former HOA enforcer, turned out to be a hell of a carpenter and had nearly rebuilt the entire dock with me by hand. We laughed about it often, about how the same guy who used to take pictures of my trash bins now helped me stain. Reclaimed wood while listening to classic rock and drinking cider. Occasionally, I'd still get letters from people outside the area. Strangers who'd read about the case online or in that Oregon legal newsletter Alan somehow got me subscribed to. One guy from Arizona sent me a handwritten thank you note and a bottle of bourbon saying I'd inspired him to sue his HOA for harassing his mother. I raised a glass to him by the fire one night. As for Karen, the last I heard, she'd been fined by the state ethics board and was trying to start a new HOA in a retirement development outside Bend. It didn't go well. Turns out when you Google her name now, the first result is Karen Blake HOA Fraud, Oregon. That sort of thing tends to follow you around. And Alan? He made a small fortune off the case. Not just from my settlement, he got a book deal. He's writing a legal thriller based on the lawsuit. Wants to call it The Boundary Line. Told me he'd change my name to something more marketable. I suggested Chad Freedom. He didn't laugh, but I did. Sometimes when I walk the trail along the lake, I pause where the old HOA sign used to hang. Welcome to Pine Hollow Lakeside Community, a place for harmony. It's gone now. The pole, too. In its place, someone carved a simple phrase into the bark of a birch tree. Peace needs no permission. I never found out who did it, but I like to think they understood. And as snow began to fall over the lake that morning, soft and slow like a curtain call, I finally realized something. They tried to fence me in. But I built the gate, and then I took the whole damn wall down. That Christmas, I hosted a neighborhood potluck at the dock. Everyone brought something. Chuck carved the turkey. Maggie made her legendary stuffing. Reggie showed up in a sweater that read HOA free since 23rd. Even the mailman came. We played trivia, drank too much, and argued over whether Die Hard counts as a Christmas movie. Near the end of the night, someone put on Bing Crosby. Snow fell in big, lazy flakes. And I stood there looking out over the lake, surrounded by the people who once watched me like I didn't belong. Now, I owned the damn lake house, and I finally belonged.